In this module, we are going to introduce how to adjust the robot to fit a subject. Once the subject is in the chair and seated, you can install the lap belt and harness. The lap belt and harness are intended for patients that need torso support. Their purpose is to help ensure that the patient is centered and that their torso is stable during the exam. The lap belt is to ensure that the patient's hips are centered. When setting it up, you should ensure that it is snug but not too tight so as to be uncomfortable. Note that the buckles are color-coded, black goes into black and white goes into white. The harness is similarly there to ensure stability and to help keep the patient centered, but in this case it's for the torso. Similar to the lap belt, the harness buckles should be tightened so that the harness is snug, but again not too tight as to be uncomfortable or to restrict movement. The next step in the process is fitting the robot to the subject. We're going to do a rough setup on each of the arms, followed by confirming that the subject is still centered, and then we're going to complete it by a final check on each of the arms to confirm that the robot is in fact set up properly for the subject. But before we do that, I'm going to do a few preliminary checks. These kind of steps often involve a bit of experience, but I can set up, for example, the elbow to approximately the right length. It doesn't have to be exact, but when I look at a subject, I can get a sense of whether or not I should be set up for a very long arm or a very short arm. Likewise, I can take a look at the arm troughs and ensure that I have the right size. The arm troughs can be removed a couple different ways. And what I want to make sure is I've chosen one that's the appropriate size. So for example, I can take the arm trough and ensure that it's going to fit appropriately with the subject's arm. I don't want it to be too loose or too tight. Once I have selected the correct arm trough size, I can ensure that they're put in place. And I'm going to again just do a bit of a preliminary positioning based on my guess of what her arm lengths are. The forearm and hand troughs only need to be positioned along the axis. The upper arm trough has an additional degree of freedom. In addition to wanting to have it centered approximately between the elbow and the shoulder, it also can move medial lateral on the axis. For most subjects, you want to have it aligned along the midline of the axis, but if you have a subject who has an excessively large biceps or triceps due to either atrophy or exercise, you may need to shift this along the medial lateral axis. Once I have that preliminary setup done, where I think I have the arm troughs approximately right, then I'm going to proceed with the initial setup. A key feature with this is you want to ensure as the operator that you are leading the process. Subjects always want to try to help, which is great, except that they don't actually know how to set things up. I'm going to turn on the shoulder indicator. There's a button here, and what that's going to do is it produces a red X, which is aligned with the shoulder axis of the robot. So what I need to then do is move the robot to the shoulder of the subject. I do that by first of all loosening the clamp, and then this allows me to move the robot in all sorts of directions. You can see that if I try to move this in here, obviously this is not going to fit in her arm because I first of all need to raise her up. There are switches on both robots that allow you to raise the subject up. And the height that I'm going to be looking for is one that will result in their upper arms at about a 5 to 10 degree angle. You do not want the subject fully parallel because that would become uncomfortable during the assessment. And likewise, you don't want them at too low of an angle because that will have them set up not appropriately for the VR. So I'm going to do an approximate height adjustment there. And once I think I have her at approximately the correct height, I'm now going to start the process. So can I have your arm? And I'm going to hold her arm, and then I'm going to be moving the robot in. And again, there is a red X that shows me where the robot's axis is, and I'm going to be trying to aligning that to her shoulder axis. And I can find her shoulder axis by putting my hand on her arm. And if I rotate back and forth gently, I can see where her arm is rotating and approximately where the axis, the shoulder axis is. I'm not going to worry at this point too much about perfection because I still need to go and check the other arm, and I need to make sure that she's still centered. Once I have it approximately right, I'll lock the robot in place. I'll take a look then at her elbow. And it's important, I always start from the midline and work outwards. So I always do the shoulder first and then the elbow. For the elbow, there's a bony protuberance on the bottom of the elbow, and I'm going to be aligning the robot elbow joint with her elbow joint. So again, I want to lift her arm while I slide the robot. It's important that I lift her arm while I do that, because if I don't, then when I slide the robot, she's going to slide with it, and I don't want her to move. Once I have that in approximately the right position, I can tighten the clamp. I'm going to do a rough fix here for the arm, the hand. Again, I'm going to lift her hand and slide the hand trough in approximately the right location. Once I have this roughly set up, I'm now going to go proceed and do the same procedure on the other arm. Again, I loosen the clamp, always taking care when I'm moving the robot that I'm using the handle. I don't grab the robot itself to move and adjust things. I'm going to come out, and once again, I'm going to be holding the subject's arm. They're going to want to try to help, but if you let them do that, then very often they will shift their position and then they'll become not centered anymore. So again, can I have your arm? So once again, I put my hand on her arm and I can rotate gently to see if I've got it approximately lined up. Once I think I do, I can tighten the clamp and then I move on to the elbow. And again, I am lifting her arm up while I adjust the robot's elbow. And that looks good. Once I have both robots configured approximately correctly, the next step is I need to double check that she is still centered. I want to make sure she's not slouched to one side or the other side. And I also want to take another look at her arms to make sure that I actually got the height adjustment set correctly. Again, I'm looking for arm angles of about 10 degrees from the horizontal. And I'm going to double check all of the joints and all the settings. And once again, I'm starting from the midline working outwards. So I'm going to double check the shoulder. After I've done that, I'm going to double check the elbow. And at this point then, I'm now going to spend time and I'm going to double check that the upper arm trough is approximately halfway between the shoulder and the elbow. For the forearm trough, typically I want it as close to the elbow as I can get it without actually being underneath that bony protuberance. This helps support the forearm to make sure that it doesn't slouch downwards. And then I'm also going to gently close in to make sure that we're not getting pinching between the arm troughs. For the hand trough position, I want to make sure the fingertips are as close to the end as possible without reaching over. So again, I'm going to lift her hand up as I adjust that back. I'm now going to go back and double check this side. And I feel like Once I think I've completed the final setup, I'm going to go through and do a couple of checks. First, I'm going to walk around to the front, and I'm going to carefully move her arms through a bit of the range of motion. And what I'm looking at is I'm looking at her shoulders to see, are the shoulders moving back and forth like this? Because if I see that kind of movement, that means I probably have not aligned the robots correctly with her shoulders. If that looks good, I'm going to do another check on her height and make sure she's still centered. And then I'm going to go through and I'm going to check again for pinching. And once again, I want to make sure that as the operator, I'm the one doing this. Don't let the subject do this, because if there is pinching, they could accidentally pinch themselves. So I'm going to close all the way in. And if I do see a problem, this is where I can adjust the positioning of either the upper arm trough and or the forearm trough. And the very last thing is to double check that everything is tight, including the clamp holding the boom in place, and then each of the little T-handles for the troughs and for the joints. At this point, the robot has now been adjusted to the subject, and we can proceed on to the next step.